Hello, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Linsay Taylor. I'm the Chair of Interfaith Scotland, and I'm here today with the Reverend Dr. Douglas Pratt. And we've been having a bit of a conversation and some lunch together, which has been lovely. But I want to talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing, because we found that really interesting in our conversations.
Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum. It's good to be here in Scotland and to learn a bit about the Interfaith of Scotland organisation that you're part of. For myself, I'm a retired professor from New Zealand. I used to be in religious studies and part of the Religious Diversity Centre of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Over the years, I've been involved in a lot of interfaith organisational activity, setting up interfaith councils and that kind of thing, but also involved very much in Christian-Muslim dialogue, but more at a global level, international level, and in an academic way also, in terms of trying to unearth, if you will, the history in terms of the text and what's been going on over the years.
Wow, that's really interesting. And can you tell us a little bit more about some of the things that you have unearthed and kind of come across in your work?
Well, it's interesting because this particular project's involved an awful lot of scholars, and I've been involved in some of the editorial side of it, and that has opened my eyes to the great diversity of relational patterns that have taken place over the centuries and in different locations. And whilst it would be fair to say that there was perhaps a dominance of negative interactions, as in polemics, there's also other kind of interactions that are much more encouraging. There's been cooperative activities, engagement with one another in terms of appeal, and the seeking for sort of a common understanding, and so on. So that the notion that there's only one way in which Christians and Muslims interact, and that's negative, is not the case at all. And I think that's a source of encouragement, because there's the old saying, of course, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And what we repeat often is negative, because unfortunately that's pretty much predominant in today's world, both here in the UK and Scotland, and also my own country, New Zealand.
No, definitely, and that's absolutely fascinating, because it is that belief that Christian and Muslim communities will never get on and have never gotten on, but obviously from your work we've seen that actually that's not the case, and I know that you've focused some of that work into actually what's happened in New Zealand and the history of Muslims in New Zealand. Yes.
I've been involved with another young scholar in unearthing some of that history and writing it up, and we now discover that the earliest Muslims would have arrived in New Zealand in the 19th century. They were sailors and so on. And then we had Muslims who came in, some of them were Chinese Muslims actually, and worked in the goldfields. At one stage, they were the ones who were acknowledged or thought to be the first, but no, there were others ahead of them in that sense. Just a trickle, not. It wasn't until getting into the 20th century that you then have communities coming in and forming Muslim communities, and then in the latter part of the 20th century you have various Muslim associations coming into being, and then an umbrella organisation called the Federation of Islamic Associations of New Zealand, and so on. And the diversity has grown, and certainly I've witnessed firsthand how diverse the Muslim community is in New Zealand, just as how diverse, and very diverse in fact, the Christian community is. And that's something which most people don't seem to fully appreciate, is that diversity is not just a matter of between religions. Diversity is something that happens within religions. And that's not to say that diversity means things are watered down or bad. It's just the way it is in terms of our histories, our patterns of activities, and a whole raft of things. But I always get amused when you get perceptions coming, for example, from some Christian quarters that who are fearful of Islam because of the assumption that Islam is a monolithic entity, and so on. And of course we know that's not the case at all. But vice versa also. I mean, there are cases where in certain parts of the world that we Muslims will have a negative perception of Christianity on the basis of an assumption that Christians are all one ilk. Yeah. And of course that's not the case.
And it's why your work is so important, because there is a lot of issues around this, the kind of fear of Islam or the fear of Christianity, and it's because of, to me anyway, the lack of understanding and knowledge of of kind of what's gone before, what's happening now, and your work is really helping to break down those barriers to see that actually things can be quite different.
Yeah, I'd certainly like to think so, and it's also a case of getting the message out there, and we are working on doing that in terms of the project I've been involved in. But I think part of the whole answer is actually just getting to know each other as human beings. You'll recall the mosque massacre tragedy of 2019 in New Zealand, which was a huge shock to everybody. And yet out of it came a most amazing event and experience, which is when you have a Muslim sheikh or mullah, the leader of a mosque, in this case the Christchurch, the main mosque, Al-Nur Mosque in Christchurch, which suffered the highest number of casualties, on national television, basically saying that what we need to do is to love and to care and be concerned for one another, and we are all in this together. I mean, he was giving a message of unity, compassion, and acceptance one of another. That at that time of year, it was just ahead of Easter, many Christian preachers so would be loving to be able to say, but it was coming through from a Muslim. And that was kind of, it made people sit up and take notice. And in the end, what that showed is that deep down in terms of the principles of the faith, of each of our faiths, there are some very strong common bonds and elements. It's a case of looking to those at times and drawing on that recognition that despite diversities either with or between religions, there is actually, from the point of view of what religions do in their principles to enhance our human being, that's actually what we need to focus on more.
No, definitely, and obviously the Christchurch massacre was absolutely devastating around the world. That obviously had a really big impact, but it's, as you've said, it's something that we can actually, some positivity has come from in New Zealand, and it's about that breaking down the barriers and carrying on that interfaith work, and that's why interfaith work around the world is so important, to really bond communities and individuals together in a more positive way, because it's what we don't know that divides us rather than what we know that can actually help to bring us together. Yes.
It's breaking down assumptions and presuppositions by not only just looking and highlighting some of the key principles that we share, but also in meeting one another in a human way. And breaking down the barriers of assumption and negativity and exclusion, and to recognise that there's something about being people of faith which, despite the differences of the details of faith, the fact that we are people of faith is something which unites us in this world where we live in a sea of unfaith.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we need to sort of look at more. It takes me back to, again, part of the sort of studies and research I've done, to the recognition that, or uncovering, and for myself anyhow, the realisation that in the early part of the 20th century, one of the stimulants to the development, if you will, of a more formal approach from Christians to Muslims and to peoples of other faiths to begin dialogue and to encounter one another in other than negative ways, was the recognition that at that stage the world was drifting more into fascism and a whole lot of political negativity and exclusivism, which we saw then played out in terms of the Second World War, for example, and the rise of communism was part of that. And there was a call at one point for people of faith to actually join together in order to try and resist, to overcome, to challenge fascism, communism, the autocratic ideologies. And we're seeing, that pattern almost being repeated today. And there's a need for people of faith to actually cooperate, not just cooperate together, but to sort of mutually recognise and support one another. Because there are times when one particular faith will find itself under some kind of attack from within wider society, often from within the so-called secular, which are rather anti-religious groupings, and fear-mongering as around that. And there's a sense in which an attack on one faith is actually an attack on all, from that point of view. So yes, there's a lot of challenges, But when one looks into the wider history and as well as more recent history, you can see there's also opportunities and realities of positive engagement, mutual support. And so I think that, for example, I understand this is Islam Awareness Month here in Scotland, and I think that is extremely good and very, very necessary in order to have an opportunity in a sense of both a physical space and a space of time to engage with one another and to break down barriers by actually seeing that we are all human beings and we all have our questions, but we all have some faith perspective, and that doesn't necessarily mean we should be opposed to each other, but actually attracted to each other.
No, definitely, and it's really important what you were saying, that the commonalities and working together and standing together as people of faith is really important. But actually you made a comment about obviously world wars, and I'd like to kind of end on this, if that's okay. You talked a little bit when we were having conversations before about Muslims, fighting within the world wars, and it would just be really interesting to hear a little bit more about that dynamic as well.
Yes, that's one of the interesting things that one of the researchers uncovered in terms of the early 20th century and evidence of the way in which Christians and Muslims reacted, for example, interreacted, I should say, in Australia. Mm-hmm. That in the late 19th century, the Australians brought in Afghans and their camels in order to have the camel trains for the desert outback of Australia. That's how the miners, for example, were able to get their supplies and all that kind of thing. But those Afghans were Muslim. Mm-hmm. And over time they settled and they formed communities. And so by the outbreak of World War I, there was actually a Muslim contingent within the Australian Army. I believe that contingent also was included amongst those who went to Gallipoli, for example. So you have this kind of notion that the Gallipoli invasion, from the point of view of the allies of Britain and particularly New Zealand and Australians who formed the Anzacs, was all kind of homogenous Christian type of whatever it was in those days. But actually there was also Muslims in there. So you had Australian Muslims, crossing swords almost literally with Turkish Muslims in that particular context. And there are other examples too that have come to light in both here in terms of the UK as well as other theatres of the war, where actually there were Muslim citizens of the British Empire, for example, who in various contexts were themselves caught up in fighting the Axis powers, which was involved with the Turkish Ottomans, in the First World War, but later on also with Nazi Germany. So that there is the sense in which Islam may be perceived as so much other that it couldn't possibly be part of us, has already been challenged by those examples, as well as other instances where there's an awareness that we have been for a long time part and parcel of the same, if you will, society in different contexts.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us today and having these conversations. So thank you so much.